The day Carl Pruitt offered a widow $15 for her dead husband's gun. He didn't know. He was looking at the woman who wrote the article he'd used as his Bible for 12 years. She didn't correct him. She didn't raise her voice. She just picked up that rusted revolver, tilted the barrel toward the light, exactly the way the article described, and asked one quiet question that made every man in that shop go completely still. By the time she walked out the door, Carl had closed his shop early for the first time in 15 years. Nobody outside knew why. The ones inside, they knew. The town of Harlow Creek, Nevada, did not appear on most state maps in 1983. It had appeared on them once, decades earlier, when it served as a supply stop, along a route that mattered, but routes changed. Highways got rerouted. And Harlow Creek became the kind of place that existed not because anyone had decided it should, but because no one had gotten around to deciding it shouldn't. There was a gas station with 2 pumps, one of which worked reliably. There was a diner called Patsy's, where the coffee was strong, and the pie was genuine, and the conversation moved at the pace of people with nowhere urgent to be. There was a hardware store, a post office that shared its building with a bait shop, which told you something about the priorities in that part of Nevada. And there was Deacon's Arms. Established 1947, according to the hand-lettered sign above the door, though the paint had been fading so long that the lettering now read more like a suggestion than a declaration. The building had been a livery stable in an earlier life, and the bones of that earlier life were still visible if you knew where to look. The ceiling was high. The shadows were deep. The floor was wide planked wood, worn smooth by decades of boot traffic, creaking in 3 specific places that Carl Pruitt knew without ever having to think about them. The smell of the place was old gun oil, old leather, and old wood soaked so deeply into the walls and floor and ceiling that it had stopped being a smell you noticed and had become simply the air inside those walls. Visitors always caught it first. They'd step through the door, and something in their posture would shift the way it shifts when you cross into a different kind of time. Carl Pruitt had stopped noticing it years ago. He had stopped noticing a lot of things years ago. On most days, Deacon's Arms opened at 9 in the morning and closed at 6 in the evening. Carl ran it alone, 6 days a week, with occasional help from his daughter Linda on Saturdays when her college schedule permitted. He had run it that way for 20 years, ever since his father passed the keys across the kitchen table one Sunday morning and said simply, "It's yours now." In 20 years, Carl Pruitt had never closed his shop early. Not once. Until that Tuesday in October of 1983, people in Harlow Creek noticed. Small towns notice these things. The hardware store owner saw the lights go dark at Deacon's Arms a full hour before closing and mentioned it to his wife. His wife mentioned to her sister at the diner. By the next morning, the question had moved around town like a slow current. Why had Carl Pruitt shut up early? The answers people invented said more about them than about what had actually happened. Some said it must have been bad news. A health matter, maybe. Someone mentioned Carl's back had been giving him trouble. Someone else said they'd heard it was financial. The shop wasn't doing well. It wasn't a secret. And maybe Carl had finally reached some kind of limit. Nobody guessed the truth. Because the truth required knowing that a woman had walked in that afternoon with an old pine box, set it on the counter, and in the space of a single hour rearranged everything Carl thought he understood about his 20 years in that trade. She hadn't yelled at him. She hadn't threatened him. She hadn't done anything dramatic at all. She'd asked one question. She'd tilted a barrel toward a light. She'd said a few sentences in a voice that didn't rise and didn't hurry. And then she'd picked up her box and walked out. Carl stood in his shop for a long time after the bell above the door rang and went still. He stood at his workbench with a rusted revolver on the cloth in front of him, turning over a single number in his mind. Not the number the revolver was actually worth. A different number entirely. 3 minutes. 3 minutes he had held that gun before forming his conclusion. 3 minutes had been enough for him to be completely wrong. Eleanor Voss woke. At 5 that morning, the way she woke every morning. No alarm. Just the particular quality of light coming through the east-facing window, gray going to pale gold, and the sound of the desert settling into its daytime stillness after the long cold of the night. She lay still for a moment. Not because she was tired, because the house required a moment of adjustment every morning, the way your eyes require adjustment, moving from dark into light. The house had been this way for 6 years. Eleanor had gotten used to it. Getting used to something she had learned was not the same as being at peace with it. She got up, put the coffee on, stood at the kitchen window while it brewed, and took in the land, 40 acres, flat and pale in the early light. The old fence line running west toward a ridge line that turned deep red at sunrise, a barn that needed repainting, had needed it for 2 years, would get it eventually. The truck parked near the gate, a 1971 Ford, rust at the wheel wells, reliable as ever. Raymond had loved this land with a particular fierceness that Eleanor had always understood but never entirely shared. She had come to love it because he loved it, and because, after 32 years in the same place, the land had grown into her daily life as naturally as breathing. But Raymond had loved it the way some men love the only thing that has ever asked nothing from them in return. She missed him in ways she had stopped trying to explain to anyone. She poured her coffee, drank half of it, standing at the counter, left the rest. Then she walked to the hallway, stood at the foot of the stairs, and considered what was at the top. On the highest shelf of the hall closet, at the end of the upstairs landing, sat a pine box, handmade, about the size of a hat box, with a brass latch gone green with age. Raymond had built it himself. One Sunday afternoon in 1962, measuring each piece carefully, fitting the joints by hand, applying 2 coats of linseed oil with a patience she had watched and admired and never quite understood. He had built it for one specific purpose, to hold one specific thing. Eleanor had not opened that box in 6 years, not since the week they buried Raymond. It had sat on that shelf through 6 Nevada winters and 6 Nevada summers, through the slow rearrangement of a house learning to hold one person instead of 2, through the gradual work of a woman deciding what to keep and what to let go. The pine box she had kept. This morning she went upstairs and brought it down. She carried it to the kitchen table, set it down, and stood over it for a moment, the brass latch green with oxidation, the faint trace of the linseed oil. Raymond had applied 20 years earlier the small dent in the upper left corner from the time it had knocked off a shelf in the barn. Raymond had said nothing, just picked it up, checked the contents, and put it back without comment. She set her hand on the lid, then she took her hand away. Not yet. She put on her canvas jacket, picked up the pine box, and carried it out to the truck. She placed the box on the passenger seat the way Raymond had always placed it, upright, stable, treated with a consideration owed to something that mattered. She went back inside for her keys and her wallet. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, taking in the half-empty coffee cup on the counter. Then she locked the door, got in the truck, and drove 43 miles. South on the state road, past the turnoff to the old reservation land, past the feed store that had been shuttered since 1979, past the water tower with the faded town name that was barely legible now. The desert opened on both sides of the road, wide and flat and pale gold in the October morning, the kind of landscape that clarifies things simply by being so much itself. Eleanor drove without the radio, one hand on the wheel, one hand resting on the lid of the pine box. She was not going to sell the gun. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself. The thought had occurred to her briefly, the way impractical thoughts occur to people who have been alone long enough to consider every option. But she had dismissed it. The gun was not for selling. What she was going to do was harder to put into words, even in her own mind. Raymond had taught her things over the years, specific things, practical things. How to read the marks on old metal, how to hold a firearm properly, how to distinguish between damage and history, between a gun that had been ruined and a gun that had simply been used. He had taught her these things carefully and without condescension. In the same way, he had taught her other things worth knowing. With patience and with the quiet assumption that she was capable of learning them. She had learned them. She believed she had learned them. But belief was not the same as certainty. And for 6 years, without Raymond beside her to confirm what she was seeing, that certainty had been slowly eroding. Not all at once. The way a fence post erodes in wet ground. Still standing, still functional, but not as solid as it once was. She was driving 43 miles because she needed to know, not whether the gun had value. She already knew what it was worth. Raymond had spent 2 years researching it, documenting it, building the chain of evidence that established exactly what it was and why it mattered. She needed to know if she still had the eyes he had given her. She needed to know if Raymond had been right to trust her with them. The state road rolled beneath the tires. The October sky was pale and cloudless and enormous. Out to the west, the first low ridges of the range were going gold in the morning light, the shadows. Between them, deep blue, every detail sharp in the dry desert air. Eleanor kept her hand on the lid of the pine box and drove. She did not hurry. She was not a woman who hurried toward things she was uncertain about. She had learned, somewhere in the long years of a life spent in this particular landscape, that the desert rewarded patience and punished impatience, and that this principle extended well beyond the land itself. By the time the water tower at the edge of Harlow Creek came into view, she had been driving for nearly an hour. She had not turned the radio on once. Carl Pruitt had been at his workbench since 8:30 that morning, repinning the grip panels on a Colt single-action Army that a rancher had brought in for general service work. It was careful work, the kind Carl did well, and he was doing it with the half attention of a man performing a familiar task while his mind occupied itself elsewhere. The radio above the workbench was playing. Something country he didn't recognize and didn't particularly like. The fluorescent tubes overhead buzzed their faint, familiar buzz. In 20 years of running Deacon's Arms, Carl Pruitt had not encountered a firearm he could not identify, date and price within 60 seconds of handling it. He was proud of that. He should not have been quite so proud of that. By the standards of the regional trade, Carl knew his work. Dealers in Reno called with questions. He had written articles for collectors' journals. He had authenticated pieces for estate attorneys and for collectors with serious money, and his opinions had held up under scrutiny. He had earned the confidence he carried. The trouble with earned confidence is that it becomes, over time, indistinguishable from something else. In the corner, at the back of the shop, 3 unpainted wooden shelves ran floor to ceiling. Carl called this section the remainder. Estate lots, bulk purchases, pieces that had never earned their way to the proper display cases. Price tags in pencil on masking tape. $8, $12, $30. The lowest shelf held the worst of it. Pieces taken in trade just to close other deals, weapons with missing components, or finishes so far gone they had crossed from antique to ruin. Carl had been planning to sort the remainder shelf in the spring. He had been planning that for 4 springs now. On the lowest shelf, behind a bowie knife with a cracked handle and a box of corroded cartridges, sat a revolver. Small frame, 5-shot cylinder. The metal had gone the deep reddish brown of heavy oxidation. The grip panels were cracked walnut. One ejector rod screw was missing entirely. The masking tape price tag, in Carl's own pencil, read $15. Carl had owned it for 3 years. He had looked at it, on average, every single morning. He had never looked at it properly, near the rifle rack on the left wall. Billy Crane and his cousin Deke occupied themselves with a scope mount, talking about nothing in particular, with the ease of men who have nowhere specific to be. Billy was 32, local, between occupations, in the way that some men in small towns are perpetually between occupations. Deke was 29 and had worked 3 months at a pawn shop in Elko, which he considered a meaningful professional credential. On his stool by the window, Hatch sat with his thermos of coffee and his newspaper. Hatch was in his 70s, a retired rancher, and he had been coming into Deacon's arms most mornings for 3 years, since his wife. Since his wife passed, he brought his own coffee because Carl's was not good. He never bought any. Carl had never asked him to leave. It was by all appearances an ordinary Tuesday morning in October. Then the bell above the door rang. Nobody looked up immediately. Eleanor Voss stepped through the door of Deacon's arms, and the bell rang once and settled, and for a moment the shop continued as it had been. Billy and Deke at the rifle rack, Carl at his workbench, Hatch behind his newspaper. Then Carl set down his tools and came to the counter. He took her in with the practiced efficiency of a man who had been assessing walk-in customers for 20 years. A woman, somewhere in her 60s, canvas jacket over a plain dress, boots that had been practical rather than decorative for some time, no hat, gray at the temples, silver where the October light caught it. Carrying an old pine box with both hands, his assessment took under 2 seconds. Widow cleaning out a house. Something left by a husband. She doesn't know how to value. Looking for a number she can feel comfortable with. Help you, ma'am. Near the window, Hatch lowered his newspaper by a fraction. He held his attention on the woman with the pine box for a moment longer than casual interest required. Then he brought the paper back up, not quite finished looking. Not yet ready to say what he was thinking, Eleanor set the box on the counter. Both hands, careful and deliberate. The habit of someone who had been careful with this particular thing for a very long time. My husband left this, she said. I'd like to know what it's worth. Carl nodded in the way of a man receiving information that confirms his expectations. He unlatched the box and opened the lid. Inside, on a bed of green felt worn thin over decades, lay a revolver. The metal had gone the color of dried rust, a deep, uneven reddish brown covering the barrel, the frame, the cylinder, and most of the small hardware. The grip panels were cracked walnut, dry and splitting, the right panel missing a chip at the lower corner, the size of a thumbnail. One ejector rod screw was absent entirely. Along the barrel, just forward of the forcing cone, a ring of pitting ran around the metal like a scar. Carl picked it up. He turned it once in his hands. He did not reach for the loop on the shelf. Behind him, he did not examine the frame markings. He did not look at the underside of the barrel. He did not ask about the gun's provenance, its history, or the name of the man who had owned it. He assessed it the way a man assesses something. He is already placed in a category. Colt Single Action Army, he said. Old one. Cavalry configuration. From the barrel length, he tilted it toward the window, turned it once more. Surface rust throughout. Grip damage. Missing hardware. Actions probably seized up. He set it back in the box. $15, he said. Mainly for the box, honestly. Box is in better shape than the piece. From the rifle rack, Deke Crane glanced at the revolver on the counter. My grandmother had one of those, he offered pleasantly, in the tone of someone contributing to a conversation they believe they've been invited to join. "We sold it at a yard sale for $10. Buyer got a good deal." He meant it kindly. Eleanor gave him exactly 1 second of her attention. Then she turned back to the gun in the box, then to Carl. "Is that your full assessment?" she said. Her voice carried no charge. Not soft. There is a difference between soft and quiet. The way a room carries no charge in the moment just before the weather changes. "That's what I can offer," Carl said. He spread his hands slightly, the practiced gesture of a professional who has delivered this kind of news before. "Pieces in this condition, improperly stored, not maintained. They're really only decorative at this point. And this one isn't handsome enough for display either." He paused. $15 is a fair number." Eleanor was still. She stood at the counter and looked at the revolver in its box. The worn green felt, the cracked grip, the missing screw, the penciled price tag on the masking tape. Then, without a word, she reached into the box and picked up the gun. From his stool by the window, Hatch lowered his newspaper all the way to the windowsill. He was watching her hands, not the revolver. Her hands. There are two ways to hold an old gun. The first way is how most people do it. You wrap your hand around the grip, feel the weight. Think about what it was made to do. That was how Billy Crane handled guns, how Deke handled them, how Carl Pruitt handled them when moving inventory from one shelf to another, or demonstrating a piece to a customer, or dropping things into boxes for lot sales. The second way is different. You cradle it. Both hands balanced across the palm, fingers clear of the action, barrel angled down and away from everything living. You hold it like a document, something that contains information you're responsible for reading correctly. That was how Eleanor Voss picked up the revolver from the counter of Deacon's Arms. Hatch caught it from across the room. Carl didn't. He was already half turned back toward his workbench, already moving on to the next thing, the way a man moves when he considers a matter settled. But Hatch caught it. He set his newspaper flat on the windowsill and held his attention on the woman at the counter, and something at the edge of his memory stirred. Not enough to name yet, but enough to keep him from looking away. Eleanor worked through the gun the way a person works, through something they have handled many times in private, with no audience and no reason to perform, not hurrying, not demonstrating. She checked the cylinder first, not spinning it, just noting the alignment, the gap, the face of each chamber. Then the frame, then the back strap, her thumb moving along the metal in a slow, deliberate pass, reading the surface the way you read a page in low light. Then she raised it, not toward the window, toward the hanging lamp above the counter, the old fluorescent fixture that buzzed faintly, and threw its light downward at a low angle. She tilted the barrel until the light caught the metal from the side rather than straight above. That sideways light found texture that direct light would have buried. Small variations in the oxidation, minute irregularities in the surface that spoke of what lay underneath the rust. Carl had returned to his workbench. Dick was examining a display of rifle slings. Billy had found something on his phone. Hatch was watching Eleanor. She held that position for a long moment, very still, barrel tilted, attention fixed on the underside of the barrel near the frame. Her expression did not change, but her grip became, if anything, slightly more careful. She brought the gun down, turned it once more, then placed it back in the pine box, not on the counter, but back in the box, on the green felt, exactly as it had been. She turned to Carl. "Did you check under the barrel?" she said. Carl set down his work and came back to the counter. "I'm sorry?" "Where the barrel meets the ejector housing." The underside, her voice had the same quality as before, level, carrying no particular pressure. A woman asking a question she wants answered. "Did you examine it there?" Carl studied Eleanor, then the gun. "Ma'am, I've been handling antique firearms since I was 14 years old." The tone was patient, professional, a man accustomed to explaining things to people who don't know what they're asking about. A Colt single-action army in this condition. Surface rust, grip damage, missing hardware. There's nothing underneath that changes the picture. Visible condition is the primary value indicator. On a piece like this, Eleanor held his gaze. "I understand," she said. She said it the way you acknowledge that something has been stated, not the way you agree with it. "But did you look?" she said. The shop held that question for a moment. Not empty air, the kind of stillness that settles when something has shifted and nobody has named it yet. Hatch put his thermos down on the windowsill beside the newspaper. Carl reached across and took the revolver. He tilted it toward the window light and found the area she had indicated. The window light was wrong for it. Flat diffuse, coming in at the wrong angle. He could see the surface of the metal, but nothing in it. After a moment, he set it down. "Nothing there worth noting," he said. His voice had changed by a fraction. "Not much." "Enough, may I?" Eleanor said. Carl pushed the revolver toward her. She picked it up, both hands, the same careful cradle as before, and then she did something Carl had not done in 3 years of owning this piece. She angled it toward the lamp. Not slightly, deliberately. Finding the exact angle, adjusting until the light hit the metal from the side rather than above, throwing the surface into relief. She held it there and studied what the light revealed. From across the room, Hatch went completely still. The stillness of a man whose memory has just delivered something he wasn't certain it still held. The shop smell, gun oil and old wood and fluorescent warmth went somewhere else for a moment. Eleanor was in a different room, their kitchen. The ranch house, deep winter of 1971. The window dark outside. First snow of the season on the ground. The furnace ticking quietly below. Raymond at the kitchen table with the lamp pulled close. A revolver on a white cloth in front of him, his coffee going cold at his elbow. She had come in from the other room, and he had said, without raising his head, "Ellie, come here," she came. She stood beside him. He reached out and adjusted the lamp, not pointing it at the gun, but tilting it, so the light came in low and from the side, cutting across the metal rather than falling straight down on it. "You see the difference," he said. Not a question. She saw it. Where the flat light had shown her a smooth oxidized surface, the angled light revealed texture, small marks, minute variations, details that had been invisible a moment before. "Raking light finds the truth," Raymond said. "Shadows are information." He turned the gun slowly in the lamplight, then tilted the barrel down toward the light source, finding the shadow area where the barrel met the ejector housing. "Look here," he said. She looked. It took her a moment. Then she found it, a small stamped mark, oval, frame. 2 letters inside. "That's an inspector's cartouche," Raymond said. "Somebody put that there 100 years ago. A government arms inspector, checking that this gun met the standard, before it went out to soldiers whose lives might depend on it." He straightened and held her gaze in the lamplight. "That man has been dead a century, but his judgment is still here. His work is still here." He paused. "Every honest mark on an old gun is a piece of someone's life that time hasn't managed to erase yet." He looked at her steadily. "Don't ever let anyone tell you what something is worth before they've looked at what's actually there." The fluorescent lamp in Deacon's arms buzzed its faint buzz. The ceiling fan made its slow revolution, its familiar creak. Marking the seconds, Eleanor stood at the counter, with the barrel tilted in the light. She knew the dent in the upper left corner of the pine box and exactly how it had gotten there. She knew the weight of this gun, how it had settled into her hands the moment she picked it up, the familiar balance she had not felt in 6 years so far as. She knew the smell of the old felt lining, faintly musty, the smell of years kept closed. She knew what was on the underside of the barrel, near the frame. She had known it before she stepped through the door. She had driven 43 miles to find out whether she still trusted what she knew. And standing there in the sideways light of an old fluorescent lamp in a half-dead Nevada town, with the barrel tilted at the exact angle Raymond had shown her 12 years ago at a kitchen table, she could see it clearly, the cartouche oval frame, 2 letters, E/H still there, after all those years, after all that rust, after the cracked grip and the missing screw in 3 years, on a remainder shelf with a penciled price tag, still there. Raymond had not been wrong. Eleanor brought the gun down and placed it on the counter. She turned to Carl. "There's a stamp on the underside of the barrel," she said, "near the frame. You need the right light to find it, but it's there." Carl moved his attention between Eleanor and the revolver. "Ma'am, I've examined." "An oval cartouche," Eleanor said. 2 letters inside, E/H. She said it the way you recite something you have known for a long time, not performing memory, stating a fact. "That's the inspection mark of Eli Hartman, government arms inspector contracted by the U.S. Army Ordnance Department, 1873 to 1879. The shop went a particular kind of still, not the ordinary stillness of a slow Tuesday morning, the kind that settles when something has changed in a room and nobody is quite ready to say what." Billy Crane had turned away from the gun rack without quite deciding to. Deke had set down the rifle sling. Hatch had not moved from his stool, but his quality of attention had shifted entirely. It was now the focused stillness of someone who has stopped waiting for something and started receiving it. Carl reached across and took the revolver. He turned it over, brought the underside of the barrel toward the window, and held it there. The window, light, was flat and diffuse, coming in at the wrong angle, showing him surface but not depth. He could not find what she was describing. After a moment he set it down. He met Eleanor's gaze. Something in his face had shifted. Not a large movement, but a visible one. The specific discomfort of a man who is accustomed to being right and has encountered a question he cannot immediately dismiss. "I'll need my loop," he said. He turned toward the workbench, second drawer. He reached for it. Linda Pruitt, his daughter, who had been working at the small desk behind the gun cases all morning, had already crossed the shop. She took the loop from the drawer before Carl's hand reached it and set it on the counter without a word. Carl registered this. He picked up the loop. Eleanor had not moved from her side of the counter. She stood with her hands easy at her sides, waiting without impatience and without satisfaction. The patience of a woman who had learned to make patience something sustainable rather than something she performed. From across the room, Hatch watched her, the memory he had been tracking. All morning shifted again, moved now not as a distant stirring, but as something with weight and direction behind it. Carl switched on the ring light of the loop and brought it close to the underside of the barrel near the frame. The ring light opened up the shadow there, the deep area that the fluorescent overhead could not reach. And Carl pressed in and held very still. The ceiling fan turned. The fluorescent tube buzzed. Outside on the main street, a truck moved past, its engine sound rising briefly through the plate glass and fading into the desert distance. Carl straightened. He did not raise his eyes immediately. He put the loop down on the workbench surface and stood looking at the grip panels he had been repinning earlier. The small tools in their arrangement, the lamp Paul's father had purchased for this shop in 1947, and which had been burning in the same spot for 36 years. Then he raised his eyes to Eleanor. "It's there," he said. His voice carried a different weight than it had all morning. "I know," Eleanor said. "Oval frame?" Carl said carefully. "E/H. He said it the way a man says something he needs to confirm aloud to fully believe. You said Ely Hartman. Hartman inspected weapons under specific Ordnance Department contracts, Eleanor said. The frame size and cylinder configuration on this gun, 5-shot, small frame, matched the Merwin Hulbert field model. One of 3 revolvers included in the 1876 ordnance purchase. She said it without elevation, without the cadence of someone proving a point, information offered plainly, to be done with, as the recipient chose. Carl picked up the loop and brought it back to the cartouche. He checked it again. The lower half of the oval was slightly elongated. The E was Roman cut, not italic, exactly as she had described, without a magnifying glass, without needing one. From the other side of a counter, on a gun she had held for less than 5 minutes, he set the loop down for the second time. He studied Eleanor Voss with a directness he had not brought to bear when she first walked through his door, when he had taken her measure in 2 seconds and arrived at his conclusion and moved on. She was not a widow cleaning out a house. She was not a woman looking for a number she could feel good about. She was something he did not yet have the correct category for, and the absence of that category was deeply uncomfortable for a man who had spent 20 years building categories. How do you know this? He said, not defensively. The question of a man who genuinely cannot account for where the morning went. My husband taught me, Eleanor said. Your husband, Raymond Vosses. She said the name simply, without ceremony. The name of someone gone long enough that speaking it no longer required preparation, but not so long that it had lost its weight. He spent 30 years with old guns. He knew what to look for. Carl absorbed that. Dake had drifted to the counter without registering that he had done so. Billy was standing near the rifle rack with his attention fixed on the glass display case. In front of him, the focus of a man listening hard and trying not to show it. Linda stood behind her father with the clear, steady attention she had held all morning, watching, absorbing, not yet speaking, but present in the way that people are present when they understand something important is happening and they do not want to miss any of it. Carl set both palms flat on the counter. He stood that way for a moment, with the loop between his hands and the revolver on the cloth to his right, and the weight of 3 years pressing down on him from a direction he had not anticipated. 3 years this gun had sat on his remainder shelf. 3 years he had passed it every morning. 3 years he had seen the rust and the cracked grip and the missing screw, and arrived at his conclusion in under 2 seconds and moved on. One woman had walked in this morning and found what he had missed, without hurrying, without announcing herself, without asking for anything except the basic courtesy of a proper look. He had not given it. From across the room, from the stool by the window, where he had been sitting all morning with his thermos and his newspaper and his carefully maintained census, Hatch spoke. He said the name quietly, almost to himself, the way a man speaks when he is confirming something he has been tracking for an hour and has finally run to ground. Raymond Voss. Eleanor turned. Hatch was on his feet. The first time he had risen from that stool since she walked through the door. He was a tall man, lean in the way of someone the desert had worked on for decades, with the kind of stillness in his bearing that comes from years of reading landscapes where stillness is information. He was watching Eleanor with an expression she recognized, though it had been a long time since she had seen anyone direct it toward her, the expression of someone who knows something worth knowing. You knew my husband? Eleanor said. Hatch held her gaze without hurry. I knew his name, he said, and I think I might know something more than that. A pause. I've been sitting over here all morning, trying to be sure. Carl had turned from the workbench. He was watching Hatch with the expression of a man who has just discovered that someone else in the room has been reading a situation he missed entirely. Hatch took one step from his stool, the deliberate step of a man who has decided something and is acting on it. There was an article, he said. American Arms Collector, April of 1971. He directed this at Eleanor. Not at Carl, not at the room, at Eleanor. The subject was authentication methods for Army Ordnance contract weapons from the 1870s. Cartouche identification, specifically. How to find inspector stamps that decades of surface oxidation had nearly buried, he paused. It described, working with angled light, a specific approach to the underside of barrel shanks on small frame revolvers. From that period, the shop was very still. I read that article 3 times, Hatch said. First, when it came out. Second time 2 years later, when I found a Walker Colt in my grandfather's barn and couldn't tell if it was genuine or a reproduction. That article was what showed me how to look at it properly. He paused. It was genuine. Worth considerably more than I had assumed. He held Eleanor's gaze directly. Third time I read it was the week after, because I wanted to understand why I had almost missed something sitting right in front of me. The article addressed that too. It said, most people approach an old firearm with a conclusion already formed. They search for confirmation of what they expect rather than reading what is actually present. The ceiling fan made its slow revolution. The author's name, Hatch said, was Avos. Nobody spoke. The fluorescent tube buzzed its faint, steady buzz outside. Harlow Creek went about its ordinary Tuesday afternoon, entirely unaware of a silence that had settled inside Deacon's arms. Carl had gone very still behind the counter. Linda had risen from her desk. Hatch held his attention on Eleanor with the steady patience of a man who has waited all morning to ask the right question, and is not going to rush the last part of it. I've been watching you handle that gun since you walked in, he said. The way you angled it toward the lamp, the way your hands found the position without thinking about it. He tilted his head slightly. I've been asking myself all morning whether you are the same Evos, or whether that name belonged to your husband. Eleanor held Hatch's gaze for a long moment. She said nothing immediately. The room waited, and what the room felt in that waiting. What every person in Deacon's arms felt in the particular silence of that October afternoon was the specific sensation of standing at the edge of something that was about to open up and show them how wrong they had been about the morning. Not just about the gun, about everything. Eleanor held Hatch's gaze for a long moment. Then she set her hands flat on the counter on either side of the pine box, and something in her face shifted, not guarded, not open. The expression of someone deciding how much truth the moment requires in arriving at an answer. Raymond signed it, she said. The room absorbed that. But, you wrote it, Hatch said. Not quite a question. I wrote it, Eleanor said. No drama in it, no apology. She said it the way she had described the Hartman cartouche, as a fact belonging to the same category as other facts, offered plainly to be used as the recipient saw fit. Carl set both palms flat on the counter. He dropped his attention to the revolver on the cloth, then back up to Eleanor. A man reassembling something that had come apart. That article, he said carefully, is in my reference file. I have used it as a primary source for cartouche identification for over a decade, I know, Eleanor said. Raymond told me a dealer in Reno had mentioned it. He was pleased. Carl was quiet for a long time. At the rifle rack, Deke had taken 2 steps backward and was examining the display of cleaning rods with an intensity those cleaning rods had never previously warranted. Billy was studying his boots. Neither of them spoke. Linda stood behind her father. She was the only person in the room whose expression had not shifted toward embarrassment or calculation. She was simply watching Eleanor, the clean, Uncomplicated attention of someone who is witnessing something they want to understand fully. Why? Carl said. His voice had dropped its professional quality entirely. Quieter now. A man asking because he genuinely needed the answer. Why let him sign it? Why not put your own name on it? Eleanor considered him. Raymond believed the editors would receive it differently if they knew a woman had written it, she said. It was 1971. He was probably right. She picked up the revolver and turned it once in her hands, her attention on Carl rather than the gun. The article was about getting people to look properly at things they had dismissed. Attaching a name that would cause dismissal before the first paragraph seemed counterproductive. She returned the gun to the box. Raymond knew it was mine. I knew it was mine. The method works regardless of who described it. She closed the lid. That was enough. The brass latch clicked shut. Carl stared at the closed box. He had been in this trade for 20 years. Dealers had called him from Reno and Las Vegas with questions. He had authenticated pieces for estate attorneys. He had written for the same journals that had published Eleanor's work. Work she had produced under a name that was not hers in a year, when that had been the practical choice rather than the just one. He had used her method. He had not used it on this gun. He had not used it because he had decided in 2 seconds what the gun was, and he had decided in under 2 seconds what the woman carrying it was. And he had been wrong about both. I owe you an apology, he said. You don't, Eleanor said. Mrs. Voss. You gave me your honest assessment, she said. You were wrong. But you were honest? She held his gaze steadily. I've had dishonest assessments from men who knew better. They're worse. Carl had no answer for that. He accepted it the way you accept something that is true and uncomfortable and cannot be argued with. Linda came forward from behind her father. Not beside him, slightly behind, the position of someone who is present but knows. This is not her moment. Her attention moved between Eleanor and the closed pine box, and then back to Eleanor, and she was putting something together quietly in the way that young people put things together when they are watching their parents encounter. Something the parents didn't expect. Had sat back down on his stool. He poured the last of his coffee from the thermos and held the cup in both hands and said nothing further. He had said what he came to say. The rest of it was between Eleanor and Carl. Carl reached under the counter and produced a business card. He set it on the glass. Man in Denver named Haskell, he said. Specialist in ordnance contract pieces. I've worked with him for years. He's thorough. A pause. He looks carefully. Eleanor picked up the card. Read it. Placed it in her jacket pocket. Carl's attention moved to the John Wayne poster on the back wall. He had hung it there the week he took over the shop from his father. He had kept it because he liked the image, the Duke on horseback, both guns raised, reins in his teeth, the absolute confidence of a man who knows exactly what he is doing in exactly this moment. He held his attention on it. Then he turned back to Eleanor. Can I ask you something? He said. Eleanor waited. Your husband. Where did he learn? The way he approached old guns. The way he saw things, he paused. Who taught him? His father, Eleanor said, William Voss. He was a scout after the Civil War. Worked in Prescott, Arizona, most of his life. She paused. William always said, every gun has a story, and the job is to be patient enough to listen. Raymond said he heard that the first time his father put an old gun in his hands, Carl went still, not a visible stillness, an interior one, the stillness of a man whose memory has just produced something unexpected and needs a moment to place it. Do you know where William learned it? He said slowly. Raymond never had the full story, Eleanor said. Just that his father had worked alongside someone, years earlier, who saw things the same way. A friend from the territory work after the war. She held Carl's gaze. Someone William spoke of the way you speak of a person who changed how you understood your trade. Do you know the name? Carl said. George Aldous, Eleanor said. A dealer out of Reno. The name landed in the room with a weight disproportionate to its two words. Carl did not move for a moment. Hatch lowered his coffee cup to his knee. George Aldous taught my father, Carl said. He said it carefully. The way you say something, you need to test aloud before you can fully accept it. Late 1940s. My father was just starting out after the war. Aldous was considered the best in the region. He paused. My father talked about him his whole life, even after Aldous retired. Even after he passed, he met Eleanor's gaze across the counter. My father had a saying he used from the time I was a boy. He said Aldous had given it to him. Every gun has a story, and the job is to be patient enough to listen. The shop held that for a long moment. Eleanor said nothing. She didn't need to. Carl understood what the morning had been. Not an ambush, not a lesson administered by a stranger, not a correction delivered from outside. Something, more like a mirror, held at the right angle, by someone who had come from the same source, traveling a different road. The same principle, passed down two lines from the same men, one line through George Aldous, to Carl's father to Carl, one line through William Voss to Raymond to Eleanor, arriving in this shop on a Tuesday in October from opposite directions. One line had kept what it was given. One had let it rust over, the way metal rusts when it isn't tended, not destroyed, not gone, just buried under the accumulation of years and habit and the particular blindness that grows in men who have been right too many times without being challenged. Still there, underneath, if you knew how to look. You didn't lose the lesson, Eleanor said quietly. You lost the discipline of applying it every time. Not just when it's easy. Carl was quiet for a long time. He turned the loop over in his hands once, then set it back in its tray. Raymond forgot too sometimes. He'd catch himself, put a piece down and start over. He'd say, she paused. What? Carl said. He'd say, I was looking for what I expected. Let me start again. She held Carl's gaze. Then he would, every time, without making a ceremony of it. Carl picked up the revolver from the cloth. He held it properly this time, both hands, balanced across the palms, barrel angled down and away. The way you hold something that deserves more consideration than you have previously extended to it. He stood that way for a moment, then he set it back on the cloth, gently, and straightened up. I need to start again, he said, not performed, not theatrical. The plain statement of a man who has arrived somewhere true and has decided to say it aloud rather than keep it to himself. Eleanor held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once. That was all it needed. Carl pulled a yellow legal pad from under the counter and set it on the glass beside the pine box. I'd like to do this properly, he said. If you'll allow it, he picked up a written description of the piece. Cartouche dimensions, serial number, if we can recover it under the oxidation, preliminary notes on the cylinder and frame configuration. He met Eleanor's eyes. Not an appraisal. I'm not the right person for that. But a foundation document for whoever examines it next. Eleanor considered the legal pad, then the box. That's considerate, she said. It's what I should have started with 2 hours ago, Carl said. He set the pen down. Mrs. Voss. I want to say something plainly. Eleanor waited. When you walked through that door this morning, I decided what I was looking at before I looked. He held her gaze directly. The assessment was wrong because I hadn't examined the gun properly. But the assessment was also the result of having already made up my mind, and that second mistake is the worst one. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Outside on the main street, a car passed, its engine sound coming briefly through the plate glass and fading into the distance, leaving the shop quieter than before. My husband came back from Korea, Eleanor said. and people saw a young man who had been through something hard and needed time to find his footing. They were kind. They meant well. She held Carl's gaze, but they saw what they expected. What was actually there was a man who had spent 2 years keeping people alive by reading situations accurately, under conditions where being wrong had immediate and permanent consequences. She paused. He spent the rest of his life applying that same discipline to everything he touched because he understood that looking properly wasn't a talent. It was a choice, made every time, not just when it was convenient. She placed both hands on the pine box. He didn't think it was anything special, Eleanor said. He thought it was what people owed to the world, the bit of courtesy of looking at what is actually there. Carl held that. I didn't come here to correct you, Eleanor said. I didn't come here to demonstrate anything. She paused. Raymond died 6 years ago. He left me this gun, the documentation, and the way of seeing things she had spent 30 years building. She held Carl's gaze steadily. I haven't opened that box. Since the week after he died, the shop was very still. 6 years is a long time to wonder whether you still have the eyes you used to have, Eleanor said. Whether what you learned was real, or whether you simply loved someone enough to believe you had learned it. She kept her attention on Carl. I came here to find out. Carl waited. And? He said. Eleanor picked up the pine box, both hands the way she had set it down. Raymond was right, she said. 3 words, no decoration. The statement of someone confirming what has been tested and found to hold. Linda Pruitt. Standing behind her father understood something in that moment she would think about for a long time afterward. Eleanor Voss had not driven 43 miles to prove something to Carl Pruitt. She had driven 43 miles to prove something to herself. The difference between those two things was the whole of it, and Linda recognized that difference with the clarity of someone young enough that the distinction had not yet been blurred by the accumulated weight of years and habit. She looked at her father. Carl was looking at the pine box in Eleanor's hands. He looked at it the way he had not looked at it when it first appeared on his counter, as something that had traveled a long distance to arrive here and had arrived carrying more than he had understood and was now preparing to travel back. Will you let me do the documentation first? He said. Eleanor considered him for a moment. Then she set the box back down. All right, she said. Carl pulled a stool to the counter and sat down. He opened the pine box with both hands and, with a care that had been entirely absent 2 hours ago, lifted the revolver out and placed it on the cloth. He positioned the lamp, adjusting the angle, the way you adjust a lamp when you have remembered that angle matters, and he picked up the loop and began to work. He went slowly. He noted the cartouche dimensions first, measuring the oval against the small ruled scale from the workbench drawer, recording the elongation in the lower half, the Roman cut of the E. He checked the cylinder indexing, the frame fit, the barrel length. He searched for the serial number under the oxidation on the frame, finding partial digits that matched the range for Merwin Hulbert production in the 1870s. He wrote everything down on the legal pad in his careful, compressed handwriting, the handwriting of a man accustomed to recording precise information in small spaces. Linda came forward from behind her father. She stood at his shoulder and watched him work, not asking questions, just watching the way you watch when you are trying to absorb a method rather than just its results. At a certain point, when Carl reached for the loop a second time, Linda picked it up from the workbench before he extended his hand and placed it where he needed it without comment. Carl registered this. He took the loop without breaking his rhythm. Eleanor watched from the other side of the counter. She watched the girl more than she watched Carl. Watched the way Linda tracked each step of the examination, the way her attention moved between the gun and her father's notes, and back to the gun, the way her hands stayed at her sides, even when she clearly wanted to pick something up. The patience in that, the recognition that this was not her moment to touch, only her moment to learn. Eleanor recognized something in it. She had stood in exactly that position once, not in a gun shop. At a kitchen table, beside a man who was showing her how to see. After about 20 minutes, Carl set the pen down. He tore the completed sheets from the legal pad with care, folded them twice, and set them on the counter. "For your records," he said. "When you're ready." Eleanor unfolded the pages. She read through them methodically, the way she read anything that mattered, without hurrying, without skimming, giving each line the attention it deserved. Then she refolded them and placed them in her jacket pocket, alongside the Denver business card. She looked up at Carl. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you," Carl said. He started to say more, stopped, began differently. "For what you showed me today, I didn't show you anything," Eleanor said. "You showed yourself. That's the only way it works." Across the counter, Linda met Eleanor's gaze. Something passed between them. Not words. Nothing that required words. The recognition of one person by another, across a distance that is not measured in years or experience, but in the quality of attention brought to the world. Linda held Eleanor's gaze. Eleanor held it back. Then Eleanor reached down and picked up the pine box. She carried it the way she had carried it in, both hands upright, with the consideration owed to something that mattered. She turned toward the door. Nobody spoke. Carl stood at his workbench with the legal pad in front of him, and the loop in its tray, and the white cloth that had held the gun for the last 2 hours. He stood with his hands at his sides and watched Eleanor Voss cross his shop floor. Billy Crane had straightened up from the rifle rack. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched her go with the expression of a man who has witnessed something he cannot entirely account for and is not sure yet what to do with it. Deke had turned from the cleaning rod display. His expression carried none of the pleasantnesses it had worn. Earlier in the morning, when he had offered his useful information about yard sales and grandmothers and $10 revolvers, he looked, if anything, like a young man who has just realized that he spoke when he should have been listening. Hatch watched Eleanor from his stool. He watched her the way he had watched her all morning, with the steady, patient attention of a man who has understood the situation from the beginning and has been waiting to see whether the situation would resolve itself correctly. Linda stood behind the gun cases and watched Eleanor reach the door. The bell above it rang once when Eleanor pushed it open. The October afternoon light came through, pale gold, the light of a Nevada afternoon, moving toward its long, slow end, and for a moment Eleanor was framed in it. The pine box under her arm, the canvas jacket, the plain boots, the silver at her temples, catching the light in the way. Silver catches light. Then she stepped through, and the door swung closed. The bell rang once more. Then it was still. Carl stood in his shop and listened to the sound of it fading. He stood there for a long moment without moving, looking at the closed door, at the October light coming through the glass, at the faded John Wayne poster in the corner of the window. The Duke, on horseback, both guns raised, the image of a man who sees clearly and acts accordingly. Carl had looked at that poster every morning for 20 years. He looked at it now differently, not at the confidence in the image, at what the confidence was built on. He turned from the window and walked to the back of the shop, to the remainder shelf in the corner. The 3 unpainted wooden shelves, floor to ceiling, with their penciled price tags and their accumulated years of things he had decided were not worth looking at carefully. He stood in front of it, the Bowie knife with the cracked handle, the box of corroded cartridges, the damaged frames and the incomplete mechanisms and the things taken in trade, just to close other deals, Waiting for the spring clean-out that had been 4 springs in arriving, he stood there, and he understood for the first time with real clarity what he had been looking at every morning for years. Not junk. Things he had decided were junk before he had looked. There was a difference. From behind the gun cases, Linda watched her father standing in front of the remainder shelf. She watched him the way she had watched Eleanor earlier, with the full, focused attention of someone who is trying to absorb something important before it passes. "Dad," she said. Carl turned. Linda came around the cases. She stood beside him and studied the 3 shelves with him, the accumulated inventory of things neither of them had looked at properly. "Can I go through it?" she said. "The whole shelf." "Everything on it?" She paused. Properly this time, Carl considered his daughter, 25 years old. Her mother's face in his attention, but cleaner, not yet worn into assumption by 20 years of being right. Still at the beginning of the discipline, rather than at the end of the habit. He thought about Eleanor Voss, driving 43 miles to test something she needed to know was true. He thought about what it meant to be the person she had been testing it against, and to have nearly failed the test entirely. "Yes," he said. "Take your time with it?" Linda nodded. She reached out and picked up the first item from the lowest shelf. A small revolver, dark with oxidation, its grip wrapped in old electrical tape. She held it in both hands, balanced across the palms, barrel angled down and away. Carl watched her. He did not correct her grip. Her grip was correct. He went back to his workbench and sat down, and for the first time all morning the shop felt different, not empty and not diminished, but changed in the particular way of a place where something that had been stuck has come loose and begun to move again in the direction it was always supposed to go. Outside, on the main street of Harlow Creek, the October afternoon continued its long golden decline toward evening, and somewhere on the state road heading north, a 1971 Ford pickup truck moved through the desert with a pine box on the passenger seat and 43 miles still to cover before home. She was almost to the truck when she heard the door open behind her. Not Carl. She knew from the footsteps, slower, more deliberate, the careful placement of a man who had learned to negotiate steps on his own terms and had made his peace slight with the negotiation. She stopped at the truck door and turned. Hatch came down the 2 steps from the shop entrance with the unhurried care of someone who had decided the destination was worth the effort and was not going to let the effort become an obstacle. He was wearing the same canvas jacket he had worn all morning and the same hat that had taken on the particular shape of the man beneath it over decades of sun and wind. He stopped a few feet from her. They stood in the pale gold of the October afternoon on the main street of Harlow Creek, Nevada, a town that didn't appear on most maps, on a Tuesday that would not appear in any record. And for a moment neither of them said anything. The street was quiet in the way of small desert towns laws in the middle of the week. A pickup truck was parked diagonally in front of the hardware store. The diner across the street had its lights on against the afternoon shadow. Somewhere distant, a dog expressed a brief opinion about something and fell silent. "I wanted to say something before you drove off," Hatch said. Eleanor waited. "I knew Raymond Voss," he said. "Not well. We met once, properly, at an estate sale outside Elko. Must have been 1969, maybe early 1970. He kept his gaze steady on her. I had a Walker colt. Found it in my grandfather's barn after he passed. I didn't know what I had. Someone at the sale pointed me toward your husband, said he was the man to ask." He paused. "I went and found him and showed him the gun." Hatch shifted his weight slightly, settling into the telling. "He sat with me for 3 hours, Mrs. Voss. 3 hours at a folding table in a cold barn outside Elko, going through that gun piece by piece, explaining what he was looking at and why it mattered, showing me how to find things myself, rather than just pointing at them. He paused again. He didn't charge me anything. He didn't make me feel ignorant for not knowing what he knew. Eleanor was very still. The gun was genuine, Hatch said. Worth considerably more than I had assumed. But that wasn't what stayed with me. He held her gaze. What stayed with me was watching a man spend 3 hours with a stranger in a cold barn because the stranger had an old gun that deserved to be seen properly. Because he believed that was worth doing. The desert wind moved through the street, warm for October, carrying the smell of dry earth and distance. I've been coming into Carl's shop most mornings for 3 years, Hatch said. Since my wife passed. It gives me a reason to get dressed. He said it, without self-pity, as a plain fact about a certain kind of life that many people in small towns understood without needing it explained. I sit in that chair, and I read the paper, and I listen to what comes through the door. He held Eleanor's gaze. This morning, when you walked in, I watched you set that box down. I watched you pick up the gun. And I recognized, not you, I didn't know your face, but I recognized the hands. The way you held it. The way you found the angle with the lamp. He paused. I thought of your husband. I thought of that afternoon in Elko. And I thought, whoever taught this woman, they taught her right. Eleanor studied him for a long moment. Something in her face that had been held carefully in place all morning, not concealed, not performed, just contained, shifted slightly, not a weakening. The opening that appears when a person who has been carrying something alone for a long time encounters someone who offers, without being asked, to acknowledge the weight of it. He would have liked to hear that, she said. Her voice was the same as it had been all morning. Level, carrying its own weight without assistance. But there was something underneath it now that had not been audible before. Audible to anyone listening carefully enough. You've kept his way of looking at the things alive, Hatch said. You walked into that shop this morning and you did what he would have done, without making it about yourself, without waiting for acknowledgement. He paused. He'd have recognized it in you. Eleanor looked down at the pine box under her arm. She looked at it for a moment, with an expression that had nothing to do with guns or cartouches or government contracts, or any of the technical matter that had occupied the last 2 hours. He was afraid I'd lose it, she said quietly, after he was gone. He didn't say that directly, but I knew. He made me promise I wouldn't let people tell me what things were worth. She paused. 6 years is a long time to keep a promise to someone who isn't there to see you keep it. Hatch nodded slowly. I know something about that, he said. They stood in the October light, 2 people on a quiet street, in a town that barely existed. And the moment had the particular quality of moments that require nothing more from the people in them than simply being present for them. He was right about you, Hatch said finally. For whatever that's worth, from a man who only knew him one afternoon in a cold barn 30 years ago. Eleanor held his gaze. It's worth a great deal, she said. Hatch put 2 fingers to the brim of his hat. Eleanor put the pine box on the passenger seat, got in and started the engine. Through the windshield, she could see the front of Deacon's Arms, the peeling sign, the faded poster in the window, the 2 steps Hatch had just descended, now standing empty in the afternoon light. She pulled out onto the main street and pointed the truck north. Inside Deacon's Arms, the bell had rung and gone still, and Carl Pruitt stood at his workbench, looking at the closed door. The shop felt different without the pine box on the counter, not emptier. Changed, the way a room changes after a conversation that has moved something that had been fixed for a long time. Billy Crane was near the door, watching the truck move north through the window. He watched it until it cleared the end of the block and became a shape in the distance and then disappeared into the desert haze. "Heck of a morning," he said. He said it with the tone of a man who is aware this is insufficient but has nothing better. Carl didn't answer. Dake was on the stool. Hatch had vacated, which he had not been invited to sit on, but nobody addressed it. He had the expression of a young man who has said something in the course of a morning that he wishes, in retrospect, he had not said. She knew what she was talking about. Deke offered to the middle distance. Carl turned from the workbench. He studied Deke for a moment. She knew considerably more than what she was talking about, he said quietly. He turned back to the remainder shelf. She knew what she was talking about, 12. 12 years before she walked through that door, the shop absorbed that the door opened and Hatch came back in. He crossed to his stool by the window, settled himself onto it with the careful deliberation of a man whose knees had opinions, and poured the last of his coffee from the thermos. Who was she? Billy asked. Who is she, really? Apart from the gun, Carl thought about how to answer Eleanor Voss. He said, "She lives on a ranch north of here, 43 miles. She's been living there alone for 6 years. Since her husband died," he paused. Her husband was Raymond Voss, a man who spent his life knowing how to look at things properly and understanding why that mattered. And he taught his wife everything he knew. Billy nodded. Working through this, she didn't have to do any of it, Linda said. She had come around from behind the gun cases and was standing at the counter, her attention on the empty space where the pine box had sat for 2 hours. Carl turned to her. "She could have walked out when you said $15, Linda said. "She could have taken the $15, gone home, contacted someone in Denver, and you never would have known what you'd had." She paused. "She didn't do that." "No," Carl said. "She stayed. She showed you what was there. She let you do the documentation." Linda held her father's gaze. Why? Carl was quiet for a moment. He thought about what Eleanor had said, about Raymond, about the discipline of looking, about choosing it every time. He thought about George Aldous, who had taught his father in a shop in Reno in 1948, and about William Voss, who had walked the same territory years earlier and arrived at the same understanding by a different road, and passed it forward to a son, who passed it to a wife, who had carried it 43 miles on a Tuesday morning to test it against the world. "Because that's not what she came for," he said finally. "She didn't come to win anything." He held Linda's gaze. "She came to find out whether Raymond was right to trust her. And once she had what she came for, there was no reason to leave without giving something back." Hatch looked up from his coffee. "She gave you the same thing Raymond gave her," he said. Carl looked at him. "How do you know that?" Carl said. "Because I watched Raymond give it to a stranger in a cold barn in 1969, Hatch said, "and it looked exactly like that." He paused. Quiet, precise, no performance. Just, here is the thing that is true. Now you have it? The shop settled into its afternoon stillness. Outside, on the main street of Harlow Creek, the day continued. The hardware store owner's wife walked to the diner. A teenager on a bicycle moved past the window, the unremarkable surface of an ordinary Tuesday in a town that barely existed on a map. None of it knew what had happened in here. Linda turned from the counter and walked back to the remainder shelf. She stood in front of it, the way her father had stood in front of it earlier, studying the 3 unpainted wooden shelves with the items he had been meaning to sort since 4 springs ago. She reached for the first item on the lowest shelf, a small revolver, dark with oxidation, its grip wrapped in old electrical tape. She lifted it in both hands, balanced across the palms, barrel angled down, and brought it to the workbench. She positioned the lamp. She adjusted the angle until the light came in from the side rather than above. Then she pressed in close and she started to look. Carl watched his daughter from the stool at the counter. He watched her find the angle, watched her bring her attention to the underside of the barrel with the patient focus of someone who has decided to look properly rather than quickly. He watched her doing what he should have been doing for years. He didn't say anything. He let her look. The desert was doing what the desert does in late afternoon, in October, going gold, not the tentative pale gold of morning, which was still feeling its way into the day. The gold of late afternoon was settled and certain, the accumulated warmth of a full day, saturating the pale earth until it seemed to generate its own light. The ridge lines going deep red to the west, the shadows long and exact against the flat ground. Eleanor drove north through all of it with one hand on the wheel. The pine box was on the passenger seat. She did not put the radio on. She drove the way she had driven down, without hurrying, without filling the silence with anything that would interrupt it. The state road unrolled beneath the tires. The desert opened on both sides, wide and indifferent and beautiful in the particular way of things that have no interest in being observed but reward observation. Regardless, she thought about Raymond, not the way she had thought about him for 6 years. That specific ache, that particular shape of absence that she had learned to carry the way you learn to carry an old injury, adjusting your movement around it. Without thinking, the ache was still there. It would always be there. But it had shifted quality today, the way pain sometimes shifts. After you have stopped fighting it and started simply acknowledging it, she thought about the kitchen table and the lamp and the winter of 1971, the way he had tilted the light without explaining why, letting her see the difference for herself rather than telling her what the difference would be. The patience in that, the respect embedded in that patience, the assumption that she was capable of discovering rather than only receiving. She thought about his hands on the gun, the deliberate way he moved when he was working with something old. She thought about the phrase he used when he caught himself going too fast, making assumptions before he had earned them. I was looking for what I expected. Let me start again, the way he said it, without embarrassment and without ceremony. Just a statement of fact, a correction applied, and then the return to the work. She thought about what Hatch had said outside the shop. You've kept his way of looking at things alive. She had not known, until he said it, how much she needed to hear it. Not from Carl, whose acknowledgment had been real, but had come at the end of his own error. From Hatch, who had known Raymond, who had watched Raymond work, who had recognized Eleanor's hands across a room before he knew her name. The truck moved through the desert, and the afternoon light moved with it, sliding slowly westward, and Eleanor kept one hand on the wheel and one hand resting on the lid of the pine box. She thought about the morning, 6 years ago, when she had stood in the hallway and looked up at the shelf and had not been able to open the box. She understood that morning differently now. She had not been protecting herself from grief. Grief had already done what grief does. It had arrived, and it had stayed, and it had become, over time, something she had organized her life around, rather than something she was still trying to survive. What she had been protecting was a question. The question of whether what Raymond had given her was genuinely hers, or whether it had only existed in the field of him, whether the understanding had lived in her, or only in proximity to him, the way certain plants grow in the shadow of a larger tree, and cannot tell until the tree is gone whether it was light they were after, or just shade. She had her answer now. The cartouche had been there, exactly where she knew it would be, exactly as Raymond had shown her, under exactly the kind of light he had taught her to use. Her eyes, her hands, his teaching. But her understanding of it, The truck rolled on, and the desert went from gold to the first pale suggestion of rose, as the sun dropped behind the western ridge, and Eleanor, drove the last 15 miles home with a quality of stillness in her that was different from the stillness she had driven south with that morning. That stillness had been the stillness of a question held carefully. This one was something else, the particular stillness of a question that has been answered. The ranch was quiet when she arrived. The ordinary quiet of 40 acres of Nevada desert at the end of an October day, with the light going off the land, and the first chill coming into the air, and the barn casting its long shadow across the yard. Eleanor parked near the gate, the way she always parked. She sat in the truck for a moment with the engine off. Then she picked up the pine box, got out, and went inside. She set the box on the kitchen table, in the center, upright, in the same place Raymond had always set it when he came home from an estate sale or a dealer visit. She took off her canvas jacket and hung it by the door. She filled the kettle and put it on the stove. While the water heated, she stood at the kitchen window and took in the land in the last of the light, the fence line going west, the barn needing paint, the flat 40 acres settling into their evening colors, the pale gold going to gray, the ridge line to the west, a dark red line against the sky. She had stood at this window most mornings for 32 years. She had stood at it most evenings too, but it was the mornings she thought of now. The mornings with Raymond beside her, both of them with coffee, looking at the land the way people look at something they have chosen and continue choosing every day. The kettle came to a boil. She made her tea. She sat down at the kitchen table. She pulled the lamp close. Raymond's lamp, the adjustable arm lamp that had sat on this table for as long as she could remember, with its warm bulb and its simple mechanism that she had never once considered replacing. She adjusted the angle. Low, raking the light coming in from the side. Then she opened the pine box. She lifted the revolver out and set it on the white cloth. The cloth she had kept folded in the second drawer for 30 years, used whenever Raymond had brought a piece to the table to work on, worn thin at the edges and yellowed at the corners from decades of careful use. She positioned it in the lamplight. She tilted the barrel. The cartouche appeared in the raking light the way it always had. Oval frame, E over H, the lower half slightly elongated, the E Roman cut. Eli Hartman's mark, placed on this metal more than 100 years ago by a man doing his job, carefully certifying that this gun met the standard required before it went out into the world to be depended upon. The mark that Carl Pruitt had owned for 3 years without finding, the mark she had found, in the raking light of a fluorescent lamp in a half-dead town 43 miles south of this table. Eleanor held the gun in the lamplight for a long time. She was not thinking about value or authentication or the man in Denver or the Smithsonian or any of the practical apparatus that surrounded the object in her hands. She was thinking about Raymond sitting at this table with this lamp and this cloth, doing what he had done at this table hundreds of times over 30 years, reading an old piece of metal with the patient attention of someone who understood that the metal had something to say and that the job was to listen. She was thinking about the first time he had brought her to the table and showed her what the angled light revealed. She was thinking about his hands. She set the revolver down on the cloth in the circle of warm lamplight, and she looked at it for a long moment. Then she spoke, not loudly, not in the voice she used for anyone else, in the voice she had used when it was just the two of them in this kitchen, at this table with the land outside the window and the lamp between them and nothing else required. She said something. What she said was hers. The kitchen held it the way this kitchen had always held the things said in it, without judgment, without echo, with the simple fidelity of a room that has absorbed 32 years of a life, lived honestly inside its walls. She sat with the lamp and the gun and the quiet for a while. Outside, the Nevada night came on, The sky went from rose to deep blue to the particular black of a desert sky, away from city lights, thick with stars, enormous, the kind of sky that makes the earth beneath it feel both very small and exactly the right size. The lamp on the kitchen table held its small circle of warmth. Eleanor sat inside that circle, with her husband's gun and her husband's lamp, and the white cloth worn thin from 30 years of careful use, and the house was the same house it had been for 6 years. But something in it had come loose, something that had been held very still for a very long time, had begun quietly to move. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday morning in early November, a car came down the ranch road. Eleanor heard it from the kitchen, the sound of tires on the dirt track that ran from the state road to the house. A sound she did not hear often. She looked out the window. A small car, not a truck, unfamiliar. It stopped near the gate, and a young woman got out. Linda Pruitt was wearing her work jacket, the same canvas jacket she had worn in the shop, and she was carrying something wrapped in cloth under one arm and a folded piece of paper in her other hand. She walked from the gate to the front door with the directness of someone who has spent time deciding whether to come and has resolved the question in favor of coming and is not going to second-guess the resolution. Eleanor opened the door before she knocked. Linda stopped. They stood on either side of the threshold. Eleanor in the doorway of the ranch house, Linda on the step below it, with the November desert behind her and the cloth-wrapped object under her arm. "My father thought this might be something," Linda said. She held out the wrapped object carefully. "Both hands on the way you offer something you have been told to treat with consideration." It came off the remainder shelf. "He spent a week with it, and he wasn't certain enough." She paused. "He said to bring it to the right person." Eleanor held her gaze for a moment. She studied the young woman on her doorstep, the clear eyes, the attention that was already present before anything had been asked of it, the way she held the cloth-wrapped object, with the instinctive care of someone who had learned in the last 3 weeks that things on remainder shelves could carry more than their price tags suggested. "How long have you been at the shop?" Eleanor said. 3 years. Saturdays mostly while I was finishing school." Linda paused. "Full time now, since September. Your father taught you?" He tried. A slight pause. Not disrespectful, just honest. "He taught me what he knew. I think some of what he knew he'd forgotten he knew, until recently." Eleanor considered the cloth-wrapped object. She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. She led Linda to the kitchen. The pine box was on the shelf above the counter, now back in its place, where it had always been, where it would stay. The lamp was on the table. The white cloth was in the second drawer. Eleanor pulled out a chair. "Set it on the cloth," she said. Linda set the wrapped object on the cloth she pulled from the second drawer and carefully folded the fabric back. "The way you unwrap something you have been instructed to treat carefully and have taken the instruction seriously." Underneath was a revolver, small frame. The metal dark and uneven, the grip cracked along one panel, the overall condition not unlike the gun that had sat on Carl's remainder shelf for 3 years. Eleanor sat down across from her. She reached out and adjusted the lamp, tilting the arm until the light came in, low, and from the side, the angle that made the invisible visible. She studied the gun in the raking light for a moment without touching it. Then she raised her eyes to Linda. "Don't tell me what your father thinks it is," Eleanor said. "Don't tell me what you think it might be." She paused. "Look at what's actually there. Start with the light. Find the angle. Then tell me what you see." Linda turned her attention to the revolver on the cloth. She studied the lamp angle. She adjusted it slightly. Not quite right, but close. The instinct present underneath the inexperience, reaching toward the correct position by feel rather than by knowledge. Eleanor watched. She said nothing. She let the girl look. The November morning was still. It's clear outside the kitchen window. The desert stretched out flat and pale. In the early light, the fence line running west, the barn that needed painting, the ridge line to the east, still in shadow. A hawk moved in a long, slow circle above the far end of the property, riding something invisible, patient and exact in its attention to the ground below. Linda leaned in closer to the gun. She tilted her head slightly, changing her angle to the lamp. She was looking for something she hadn't been taught to look for yet. But she was looking in the right direction, with the right quality of attention, and she was not hurrying, and she was not deciding before she had looked. Eleanor recognized all of it. She had sat in exactly this position once, not in Schaefer, at this table, in this kitchen, with this lamp, beside a man who was showing her how to see, a man who had understood that the most useful thing one person can give another is not an answer, but a method. Not a conclusion, but a way of arriving at conclusions that can be trusted. Raymond had given her, that she had carried it for 32 years at his side, and for 6 years alone, and she had driven 43 miles on a Tuesday in October to find out whether it still held. It held, and now it was her turn to set the lamp at the right angle and sit across the table from someone who was learning to look and do what Raymond had done, say nothing that would shortcut the looking, offer nothing that would substitute for the seeing, just hold the space and let the work happen. Look at what's actually there. Start with the light. Find the angle. Linda leaned closer still. There's something here, she said slowly. Not certain, not performing certainty, just reporting what her eyes were beginning to find, under the barrel, near the frame. I think there's a mark. Yes, Eleanor said. She said it quietly, not confirming the content of the mark, not telling the girl what it meant or what it was worth or what the next step should be, just confirming that she was looking in the right place, that she had found the angle, that she was seeing what was actually there. Keep looking, Eleanor said, and Linda did. Outside, the hawk completed its long, slow circle and banked west toward the ridge, and the November desert went about its morning, in the way the desert always goes about its mornings, patient and exact, and entirely indifferent to what is transient, and entirely faithful to what is not. The lamp held its circle of warm light on the kitchen table, and inside that circle the work continued.